Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming down on this very special afternoon. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, so you know how many fantastic events we put on here at Books and Books. And there's another special event I just want to remind you of is that this Tuesday at 8 p.m. at the University of Miami, we're going to be presenting Arianna Huffington. So you could make those arrangements, purchase your voucher at the counter. And for those of you here in the house, we are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables. So a reminder for our internet audience at home, if at any time during the presentation you would like to purchase a copy of the book, you can just call the number on your screen. We will arrange that for you. We will have the author sign it, and we will ship it to you wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you who are watching from overseas, the shipping charge might be just a little bit more. This afternoon, Books and Books is honored to present Ms. Emma Donoghue and her new book, Frog Music. And here to present Ms. Donoghue, please welcome to the microphone a graduate student in creative writing at Florida International University, Ms. Fabienne Josephat.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, I should say. It is with great honor that I'm introducing Emma Donoghue today, and it's an especially exciting moment for me as a reader and writer because I'm an avid Donoghue fan. I first heard of Emma Donoghue 4 years ago when I started a master's in fine arts at FIU's creative writing program. I was writing a thesis, in my case a suspense novel, which entailed defending it to a committee and producing a reading list, and on that list I was required to jot down the writers and the books that have contributed to my formation as a writer. And on top of that list, inevitably, was Emma Donoghue and her novel, Room. I had read it with special interest when friends and professors had recommended it in my first year of the program. We were at the time unaware that my thesis would be a historical fiction novel of captivity and escape about characters confined in a cell. I remember the heart flutter and the quickening of my breath while reading Room, the way I clutched the book and turned the pages faster and faster, clinging to every word. The suspense of Room had captivated me, and I was entranced by Emma Donoghue's craft. Her ability to keep me riveted by stretching out the suspense, by increasing the tension at the right moment, and her masterful grasp of language and psyche, her ability to enter the mind of a child and take charge of a life-threatening situation where everything was at stake made me want to imitate her. I knew right away I wanted to write like that. It was inspiration at its finest. What I love about Emma Donoghue is her ability to pull me in. As her reader, I am immediately connected with the world she's crafting and setting up. I am transported within the story. I'm in the character's skin, in their shoes, and I view everything through their eyes. I felt the physical and emotional pain and anguish of the characters in her novel, and it didn't matter that I was trapped in a room with them. Every day, every moment held its weight, and every item in the setting of this room was connected to the character and helped shape their past, as well as their present and their future. That is the sort of skill it takes to write great fiction, wonderful, suspenseful storytelling, and that's what makes Emma Donoghue a master at her craft. Born in Dublin, Emma Donoghue is an Irish immigrant who spent 8 years in Cambridge doing a PhD in 18th century literature before moving to London, Ontario, where she lives with her partner and their 2 children. She also alternates between writing literary history, biography, stage and radio plays, fairy tales, and short stories. She has written historical novels like Slammerkin, Life Mask, Landing, The Sealed Letter, and more contemporary works such as Stir Fry, Hood. Her international bestseller Room was a New York Times Best Book of 2010 and was a finalist for the Man Booker, Commonwealth, and Orange Prizes. In her new novel, Frog Music, Emma Donoghue takes us to a new setting, San Francisco in 1876, where a long-forgotten unsolved murder has been committed against the person of Jenny Bonet. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Emma Donoghue.
How toll for my water to go in. I speak as someone who has often, in the vigor of my craft, knocked water all over a podium. And wouldn't it be embarrassing to be live streamed doing that? This is my first time being live streamed. It's very exciting. And it's also a great pleasure to be here today and to have taken off my Canadian down jacket and stepped out into the sunshine of Miami. So it's lovely to be here. This book was meant to be entirely about Jenny Bonnet, a 27-year-old woman who got shot to pieces through the window of a grimy little saloon bar in San Francisco on the 14th of September, 1876. And it is about her, but it turned out to be even more so about the other woman who was in the room at the same time and who escaped unscathed because she was bending down to undo her shoelaces. And that other woman is Blanche Benon, a French immigrant and burlesque dancer. Almost everything in Frog Music is real, which made it a fiddly task to write, but it gave me a kind of a double thrill because I so enjoy the forensic pleasures of trying to track down these long forgotten, obscure nobodies and in many cases lowlifes, tracking them down in censuses and city records and ships' passenger lists and finding every tiny bit of information I could. But then there's also the secondary pleasure of when the information runs out, you say to yourself, well, I can just make this bit up. So for instance, I know that Jenny Bonnet was friends with Blanche and Blanche's lover Arthur and his friend Ernest by the time it all went very pear-shaped and she ended up dead on the floor. But I don't know how they met or when, so that's one of those moments where I'm free to purely invent. So here is San Francisco on a hot, hot August early evening after Blanche has been performing one of her saucy dances at the House of Mirrors brothel. Oh, and I should also mention that San Francisco was in the middle of the worst smallpox epidemic it ever had, and a record-breaking heat wave. And I didn't have to make any of this up. It was just crying out to become a novel. Blanche pivots to cross Kearney Street, but she has to wait for a horse car to rattle by first. The fist-shaped cobbles release all the stored heat of the day into her shoes' thin soles. She steps out in the streetcar's wake, watching for fresh dung in the uncertain dusk, which means she doesn't see the bicycle till it's on top of her. Black, antlerish handlebars, that's all she has time to glimpse before its gigantic spokes are swallowing her skirts. Her scream seems to break the machine in two. The bicycle explodes one way and the rider another, smashing Blanche to the ground. She tries to spring up at once, but her right leg won't bear her, her mouth too dry to spit. The lanky daredevil who knocked her down jumps up, rubbing one elbow as lively as a clown, and says, "Ça va, mademoiselle?" The fellow is observant enough to read Blanche's Frenchness from her style of dress, and the accent is as French as Blanche's own, but the voice, it's not a man's, Blanche realizes. It's not a boy's voice even. This is a girl, for all the grey jacket, the vest, the pants, the jet hair hacked above the sunburned jawline. She's been knocked down by one of those eccentrics on whom the city of San Francisco prides itself, which only aggravates Blanche's irritation, as if the whole collision were nothing but a gag, and never mind who's left with merde on her hem. A cart swerves around Blanche, where she's kneeling in the street, hooves close enough to make her flinch. She gets up on her knees, but she's hobbled by her skirt. The young woman in pants holds out a hand, teeth flashing in a grin. Blanche slaps it away. For this female to run her down and then smirk about it. A long screech of brakes means there's another horse car at the crossing bearing down on them. So the stranger offers her hand again with a theatrical flourish. This time Blanche grabs hold of the cool fingers and wrenches herself to her feet, hearing a seam rip under one arm. She staggers over to the sidewalk, her skewed bustle bulging over one hip. And as she shakes out her aching right leg, she realizes she's alone, because the daredevil has run half a block up Kearney Street and is roaring in English at some urchins who've seized their chance to make off with her fancy bicycle. Serves her right if it's gone, thinks Blanche. But by the time Blanche has hauled her bustle straight and slapped the dirt out of her skirts, the rider is back, perched above the gigantic 5-foot front wheel. Hops down, she glides down the street to Blanche, then swings one leg over, hops down and hits the ground running. "Jenny Bonnet," she announces as if it's good news. The accent thoroughly American now, even if she does say her surname in the French way with a silent T. She tips her black hat to a natty angle and she says, "And you are?" "None of your business." Blanche blows at the strand of hair that stuck to her damp lip, and she summons her crispest English, because what Blanche lacks in height she can make up for in hauteur. "Listen, you he, she, whatever," she says. "The next time you get the notion to make the street your playground—" "Yeah, this thing's the devil to steer," interrupts Jenny Bonnet, nodding as if they agree. She only has about 6 inches on Blanche up close. "I didn't hurt you though, did I?" Blanche bristles at the question. "I'm bruised from head to toe." "No bones sticking out though?" The young woman makes a show of looking her up and down, mugging for a laugh. "No actual bloodshed per se?" "You might have killed us both, imbecile." "Well, if it comes to that," says Jenny Bonnet, "I might have fallen off a steamer to Lima this morning, and you might have caught your death." She jerks her thumb at a smallpox flag marking a tobacconist just behind them, and Blanche jerks back and takes a few steps away. "Instead, it appears we're both safe and sound, and so's my high-wheeler." Jenny lets out a cowboy whoop. And oddly enough, Blanche's wrath does begin to lift a little. Maybe it's the whisper of a breeze rising off the bay, where the masts of the quarantine junks and clippers seem to be swaying a little, unless that's a trick of the dusk. Maybe it's the soft trill from a flute player in some apartment overhead. The lights are flaring on in the cafes and shops along Kearney Street, and soon Chinatown's border will be as glittering as a carousel. "Let me buy you a drink," suggests Jenny Bonnet, nodding towards Johan's brasserie. Blanche always likes the sound of that. "As an apology?" "If you like," says Jenny. "Never found apologies worth the candle myself." Blanche hoists her eyebrows. "If you're sorry, folks can tell," remarks Jenny. "No use piling on the verbiage." She lays her huge bicycle flat outside the brasserie's door, and she beckons a boy over to guard it. "Do you reckon this kid won't run off with it as fast as the others did?" asks Blanche, sardonic. "I know where this one lives," says Jenny. That disconcerts Blanche. "I never imagined these street urchins as living anywhere in particular." Jenny nods up at the building's rickety overhang. "He's a Johan." As the two women step into the garlicky fug, a couple of customers glance up, but nobody gives the young woman in pants a second glance, which means this Jenny must be a habitué. Monsieur Johan greets her with a nod, and he clears a space at the bar with his elbows. His fat moustache is leaking wax as he comes back and slaps down their glasses and a carafe of wine. Blanche pours it and takes a long drink. "Ah, that's better." She wipes sweat out of her eyes. "Aren't you sweltering under all those layers?" she asks. A shrug as Jenny fills her own glass. "September can't come too soon for me," says Blanche. "It has to cool down by then." "Ah, the city's the exception to any rule," says Jenny. "I've known it to be hottest in October." Blanche groans at the prospect of that. Johan returns with 2 bowls of cuisse de grenouille au beurre noir that they didn't ask for. Discovering that she is hungry, Blanche rips the firm aromatic flesh from the frog thighs. "These aren't like back in France." "No, they're better," Jenny counters. She lets out a grunt of pleasure as she chews. "Only 10 minutes dead, that's the trick, but a touch too salty. Tell him he's still over-salting," she throws at Johan. The owner thumbs his moustache off his unsmiling mouth. "Poctal!" he roars over his shoulder towards the kitchen. "How long have you been here?" Jenny asks Blanche. "Since the winter before last." "So why have you stayed?" Blanche blinks at the question. "You have no manners, miss." "Oh, I've got some," says Jenny. "They're just not what you might call pretty. Diamond in the rough, that's me." Blanche rolls her eyes. "And why shouldn't I have stayed here, may I ask?" "Well, most move on through," observes Jenny, "as if San Francisco is just a mouth swallowing them whole, and then the rest of America is the belly where they end up." Blanche winces at the image and pours herself more wine. California was Arthur's choice, she recalls. Blanche couldn't have found it on a map. All the French they got into conversation with on a ship were heading to some big city, New York or Chicago, if not San Francisco, where it was said the hospitality trades paid well. "We came because we heard you can cock your hat as you please here," she says, "and we stayed for the same reason, I suppose." "Who's we?" says Jenny Bonnet. But Blanche has had enough of all this questioning. "And you," she says, "when did you arrive?" "Poctal!" roars Johan again towards the kitchen. "I was 3, says Jenny, her neat teeth nibbling the last frog leg. "But even then I was choosy about my food." "What are you now?" asks Blanche. "Still choosy," says Jenny. No, says Blanche. "I mean," a chuckle from Jenny Bonnet. 27. "Really?" "Huh," says Blanche, not pleased. "That's 3 years older than me, and I still look pretty fresh." Jenny grins back at her, neither agreeing nor contradicting. It must be your outfit, says Blanche with a sigh, nodding at Jenny's pants. It's as odd as all get out, but it does take years off you. They're bantering, Blanche notices, as if they've always known each other. She's not one for making friends with women as a rule. A mournful face looks through the hatch from the kitchen, and Monsieur Durand snaps at him. Ease up on the salt, Jeanne says. This must be Portal. The cook makes a small but obscene gesture in Jenny's direction. You know I'm right, mon vieux, she tells Portal. Stick to swamp wading, he says. He mops his forehead with his sleeve and disappears into the kitchen. So come on now, says Jenny to Blanche greedily. Who are you and what's your story? Hold on, swamp wading? Blanche repeats. I caught these last night out by Lake Merced, Jenny tells her, holding up a glistening bone. That's your trade, says Blanche? Hunting frogs? Well, it would go some way to explaining the young woman's get-up. Don't they give you warts? That is pure dumb superstition, says Jenny, and offers her small hands for examination. They seem brown but smooth. Couldn't you work at something, I don't know, less disgusting? Guess I don't disgust easy, says Jenny. The city has 300 restaurants, and the French and Chinese ones all need frogs. But they're such ugly, clumsy creatures, protests Blanche. Clumsy, says Jenny. You ever seen them swim? Now that she thinks about it, Blanche realizes she's never seen a live frog except on sale in barrels on Dupont Street. But the smell, she says, the slime. Ah, that's fish you're thinking of. Frogs don't smell of anything, Jenny corrects her. And without a touch of slipperiness, you can't have it both ways. Both ways? Asked Blanche. Live on land and in water as well. I call that crafty. Blanche purses her mouth. That's my glass you're drinking out of, by the way. Jenny blinks at it. Sorry. She gestures to Durand for another. Sorry, she said. An apology at last, marvels Blanche, satirical. When the proprietor slaps a clean glass down in front of her, Blanche refills it and strips the last shred of garlicky meat from a delicate frog bone with her teeth. Since you've drunk from my glass, she tells Jenny, you should be able to read my thoughts. Oh, except you'd probably call that more pure dumb superstition. Jenny froze her brow. Your name is Patience Vautrien, and you're a dairymaid. Blanche makes a small sound of outrage because dairymaids are known for their reek. I did once work with horses, she says, a fact if a misleading one. But not anymore? Jenny presses her temples, frowning with effort. You're Mrs. Hector Losange, mother of 5 lovely offspring, known for her charity teas. She waits and tries again. You're Arabella de la France, lady spy. Oh, enough, says Blanche, the joke suddenly souring on her. As if it's not as clear as day from her flowered bodice, fuchsia skirt, and general gaudiness that she's a showgirl at least, and probably on the town. And why should she care, who knows? If Blanche didn't want to be recognised for exactly what she was, she wouldn't dress this way, would she? She never exactly intended to end up a soiled dove, that curious euphemism, but nor can she remember putting up any real objections. She stepped into this life like a swimmer entering a lake, a few inches at a time. So where did you grow up, Jenny Bonnet? She asked to change the subject. America's belly or its mouth? Some gristly part anyway, Jenny jokes instead of answering. How much? Asks a man at Blanche's shoulder. She decides to assume the stranger is addressing Durand. Have you family? She asks Jenny. Found under a cabbage leaf I was, says Jenny Bonnet deadpan. I said how much? The American man is breathing right in Blanche's ear, and she can smell the chaw in his mouth. I'm eating, she says, without looking round. Only asking a civil question. The big man squeezes up to the bar between the two women, dark wheels of sweat under his arms. You're bothering the lady, mentions Jenny. He turns to look Jenny up and down. You reckon I can't afford her? Jingling coins noisily in his pocket. 'Cause for your information, I could hire 6 of this slut with change to spare. As the fellow says, Jenny remarks pleasantly, better keep your mouth shut and seem stupid than open it and remove all doubt. The last thing Blanche wants is a quarrel. Across the man's bulk, she frowns furiously at Jenny. You calling me stupid? Asks the fellow after a second's delay, reddening as he shifts his quid of tobacco to the other cheek. A leather-headed lunk of the highest order, says Jenny. He presents his fist for inspection, inches from her face. Somebody ought to teach you to keep your nose out of other folks' business, girlie. My friend Mr. Colt here would not concur. Jenny slides her jacket aside to show a tapering shape in her trouser leg, and Blanche is off her stool and an arm's length away, butter dripping. Absurdly, she wishes she'd picked up her napkin to wipe her mouth first. "Oh," growls the American, "you've got nothing on me that impresses me, you puny goddamn morphodite." Johan has finally noticed what is brewing in his brasserie. "Door!" he roars, pointing towards the door. Jenny hops down from the stool willingly, a harlequin in a pantomime. The American follows obediently. But when Jenny holds the door for him with flip courtesy, he backhands her into the wall. The crack of the young woman's skull against a faded print of the Champs-Élysées makes even the most dogged drinkers glance up briefly. "Monsieur Johan!" Blanche protests. But the owner, as if he's seen this happen too many times, just raises his eyes to heaven. Jenny, with the look of a stunned calf, bends to retrieve her hat. The print falls to the floor with a tinkle of glass, and now the connard has her wrist behind her back and he's marching her out, using her shoulder to shove the door open. Blanche races after them, yanks at his arm. "Have you no shame?" she says, "wailing on a female like some brute." The American flicks Blanche against the wall. Struggling for breath and clutching her side, Blanche curses her size. At times like this, she feels like some fairy in a world of trolls. The man has dropped Jenny on the sidewalk. Is he going to stave her ribs in or stamp on her head? Blanche lets out a wail. No, he just lands a squirt of brown tobacco juice on Jenny and slouches off down the street. Without a second glance at Blanche, she notices, which tells her it was a row more than a woman he was itching for all along. She leans on the windowsill of the brasserie, dizzy. The leg bruised by the bicycle wobbles under her and her ribs throb. Nothing's broken, though. Blanche has enough experience from her circus days to know that. Kearney Street is humming around them now, burners and reflectors multiplying the light of oil lamps in every storefront. Drinkers are shuffling arm in arm from bar to bar, bawling out dirty choruses. Knots of men head for the bordel on Commercial or Pacific to sample Jewesses, Mexicans, black girls, Orientals, though they will still pay highest for French, Blanche thinks with a certain satisfaction. It's a river of faces, festively red-eyed, as if the men have given up even trying to sleep till the heat breaks. And smallpox be damned, nobody's staying in tonight. Jenny Bonnet sits up and lifts her sharp chin with an attempt at a grin. Her face is swelling up already from the man's blows. A dark-edged cut shows below the left eyebrow. She turns aside and she pukes her supper of frog's legs neatly into the gutter. How this evening has complicated itself. Blanche should really just walk away right now from this gun-packing jester who has caused her damage twice in as many hours. Life in the city by the bay is demanding enough without the company of a young woman who runs towards risk like a child to bonbons. But she lets out a long breath because the fact is Blanche hasn't had so much fun with a stranger since leaving France. Their little circle in San Francisco is composed of Blanche, Arthur, Ernest, and whoever the two men bring home, so Blanche can't think of another acquaintanceship she's formed as fast on her own as tonight's with Jenny Bonnet. Such a strange sense of familiarity and ease along with the novelty. "You should slap a bit of meat on that eye," she advises. A derisory grunt from Jenny. "Where do you live?" asks Blanche. "Nowhere in particular." What a one for secrets this young woman is. "Come on, let's get you home," says Blanche, holding out her hand. "Don't have one. Fact is," says Jenny, clambering to her feet, "I'm only out a week." Out? Oh, doesn't that just take the cake, Blanche thinks. A jailbird. "What were you in for?" "Oh, the usual," says Jenny. "Appearing in the apparel of the other sex," she quotes in a pompous voice. Blanche frowns. Can that be an actual crime? "Well, if this outfit gets you arrested," she asks with a hint of impatience, "what makes you keep putting it on?" "It suits me," says Jenny, so deadpan that Blanche doesn't even register the pun on suit until a second later. This young woman's spirits sure revive fast. "You must be lodging somewhere," Blanche persists. I've been high-wheeling mostly," says Jenny. Zooming along on that contraption night and day, Blanche thinks. "What, you sleep on the wing like some seabird?" "I take naps in parks or theatres or on a friend's sofa when I feel the need," Jenny concedes. There's blood trickling into her collar, Blanche notices, and a trace of vomit on her chin. Blanche lets out a small groan. She supposes it was for her sake, out of some kind of misguided gallantry, that this curious female got herself beat up. "Come on," she says. "I'm just a step away on Sacramento Street." "Lady," says Jenny Bonnet, "what makes you think you have to—" "Oh, come on if you're coming," snaps Blanche. Leave that there, thank you. I've never written a book in which people are more consistently hot. And because of all the other activities they engage in this book, some mentionable and some not, I've been told that you need a good shower after reading it. But in my experience, readers always like a trip to somewhere very different, even if the results are sticky. I did a rewrite of the book during the height of our summer up in Ontario. Contrary to popular belief, we have a really hot season in Canada. Really, during several months of the year, it's just as hot as this. So that was very handy for the rewriting. Who's going to ask me the first question? The world is listening. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. How do you feel about juggling writing contemporary novels, such as Landing, for example, and more historical novels? Do you find that the historical novels offer a particular kind of relief, maybe, from writing the contemporary ones, or vice versa?
Yeah, I love them both. People often say to me, which is the form you really like? And they always assume that sinister publishers have forced me to write the other. But nobody forces me to write anything. My career is such an oddball zigzag. I'm often amazed when somebody says to me, I've read all your books, and I think, really? Who but me could share that particular range of interests? But yes, I began with a couple of contemporary ones. I moved into historicals, but then I go back to contemporary regularly because I find certain pleasures come more easily with contemporary. Humor is easier to do in contemporary ones because, when you share an everyday language and little details of everyday life, it's easier to get the reader to go, oh yeah, and make the joke happen. But historicals offer me such vivid and strange worlds. And one thing I really enjoy with historicals is it's not that I put 20th, 21st century values into them. It's more that I probably pick characters, real people who were rather ahead of their time. I go for the rebels. So somebody like Jenny Bonnet, with her particularly, carefree approach to cross-dressing, was centuries ahead of her time. In San Francisco now, she'd be unremarkable. But in San Francisco then, she was the only one. Lots of women had cross-dressed in the Civil War, for instance, but in a very much cap down and try not to get found out sort of way. So for Jenny Bonnet to be this known public character who was arrested roughly once a month for cross-dressing and yet kept such gaiety about it. She would, in the newspaper reports that the novel is inspired by, she was cracking jokes in court, She said to the judge, if you don't want me to wear pants, I'll just have to go naked because I don't have anything else, So she kept up this sense of humor. I don't know how it was possible to have a sense of humor about cross-dressing in 1876. So historicals are very satisfying to me for that huge challenge of creating another world. And I particularly like finding elements which are timeless and universal. So the reader is like, she's just like me. And then next minute you reveal some aspect of the mindset of the times, which is so different that the reader is, who are you? And really, whatever historical period you pick, you can achieve that kind of double effect. If they're like us, they're not like us. So it sort of keeps the reader on their toes, And the funny thing is that before Room, I wanted to keep up both kinds, but my publishers were sort of like, another historical would be great. They sell so much better. And then Room sold far better than all my previous books. So now they probably think the reverse. But in each case, I don't pay any attention to what the publishers say.
You kind of answered this in your remarks, but I was wondering how much of Jenny, the personality, actually came through in like the newspaper accounts, and how much that was invention, the jokes and the swagger.
I think what I do is extrapolate. So in about 2 of the newspaper articles, she's joking, but still, even for 2 jokes to make it into an 1870s court case, that shows quite a high level of jokery to me. And she lived flippantly. She was often arrested for public drunkenness as well as for cross-dressing. And she had quite a complicated life. For instance, she'd been married or lived with a man in the past, and then, by the time Blanche got to know her, she wasn't. So she had a complicated and very traumatic past, which she seems to have said almost nothing about. So plenty of people who knew her didn't know her background. She'd been a child actress to start with. So all those things gave me the sense that she would be a constant wisecracker, and that she would use humor to keep real questions at bay. So I devised a kind of an idiom for Jenny that she'd clip all her sentences. I decided she would almost never start, in particular with the word I. You know, she'd just drop that bit. She'd go straight on to the verb. So it was great fun having her slightly cross-dress in her grammar even, you know, in her sentence structure. But of course I had to make up a lot. The reason I decided to make her homeless by choice is that, oddly enough, in the sources there was no mention of where she was lodging. And usually in these reports, they'll, you know, like they tell you the building that Blanche owned on Sacramento Street, they'll usually specify where people lived. And she just turns up as a drifter, you know, half the time out in the countryside, catching frogs, and before that she'd been a shepherd, so clearly a big nature lover, and staying over at various hotels, but you never get any reference to an actual address of hers. She had a father in Oakland she visited sometimes, but she just, the negative evidence of nobody mentioning an address of hers made me think she was homeless. I invented the bicycle because I wanted a way for her to move around that was the extreme sport of its day. It would be like parkour nowadays. It would be like, oh, look at that crazy girl on the bicycle! Because that's one of the many physical experiences that I feel I've had for this book, but in real life I haven't. I mean, there's no way I could ride on one of these things. You had to somehow lean them against the wall, you know, stand up on a tiny peg, sit on the seat on the 5-foot front wheel. There was a tiny little wheel behind. And then for relative safety, as you headed down San Francisco's hills, you were advised to put the feet over the handlebars so that when you hit a rut, you could spring free. I mean, it's just a recipe for death, you know? So I just thought that a high-wheeler bicycle was the ideal expression of Jenny's character. So yeah, extrapolation is the process as I describe it. And the same with Blanche. I knew that she was a good-time girl, shall we say, and there was one newspaper article that mentioned her dancing in a show called The Three Lively Fleas. So, and of course, nobody wrote detailed reviews of Strip in those days. Nowadays, you can probably get detailed blogs about it, but in those days, people would just say, oh, a very saucy show down at the House of Mirrors. So I had to try and figure out how they danced. And you might say that's obvious, but it's not. For instance, they didn't strip successively taking off their clothes. That's a very 20th century notion. So all the things we think of as routine for that trade today, like, say, pole dancing, it's very much of our time. In those days, it had a lot more humor to it. So I found a lot of postcards of erotic dancers. Burlesque theatre and specifically erotic dance kind of overlapped. But the postcards show the craziest costumes. Sometimes they'd be in kind of breastplates or bows and arrows or, you know, sort of pseudo-military jackets, but then just tights. It was all about the leg. There was no emphasis on the breasts at all. And some of the costumes had things like a horse's head, you know, just ludicrous things. So from that, I had to assume that Blanche's act would have elements of humour and theatricality and song, as well as the more standard sort of showing a leg. So, yeah, I had an awful lot of sources, but they were all tiny little things that I had to then expand on, you know.
How did you first discover this case?
Somebody else's book. Every book is grown from a soil of other books. Jenny Bonnet has never been fully forgotten. For instance, she's turned up in a comic strip. She's turned up in a clog dancing troupes. They have a dance named after her. I think in the Bay Area in particular, she's never been entirely forgotten. But she, as always happens, her reputation has survived in a particular form. Like, she's often said to be the leader of this gang of pickpockets who she recruited from the sex trade. There's this notion of her that she went up to prostitutes and said, leave all that behind and come and be a pickpocket with me. Now, this is all based on one particular newspaper article written several years after her death, which I find completely unrealistic. But, you know, that is the form. She's turned into a kind of an urban myth. But I came across her in a book called Wild Women, a kind of compendium of Victorian rebellious women. And it was a very flippantly written one-page summary of her death and the circumstances around it. I'm not doing a spoiler, by the way, because she dies on page 1. So yeah, I would think I was just intrigued by her character and the oddity of this, you know, playful figure who sounds like everybody's friend and then suddenly got murdered. The kind of clash between comedy and tragedy, I suppose. And then what really surprised me is that the book turned out to be narrated from the point of view of Blanche, the survivor. And there's this one throwaway line in Jenny's inquest reports where Blanche suddenly says to the coroner, and I have a baby who his father, my ex-lover, has taken away and I don't know where that baby is. So I was thinking, hang on, I better just check out this about the baby. And that, in a way, becomes the heart of the book because I follow that storyline. So I would say simultaneously Blanche is trying to solve Jenny's murder but also trying to get her baby back. And it's funny, I hadn't intended for this book to have anything in common with Room because Room was great, but I wouldn't want anyone to think I was trying to kind of chase that audience again. It's so obvious when you pick up somebody's book after a big hit and you go, oh yeah, same ingredients, just slightly stirred. So I was like, this one's going to be entirely different. But then it turns out to be, you know, a woman who has a baby in her mid-20s and finds it, you know, an enormous challenge to become a mother. The difference is that mine, Room, is very heroic and strong and good, and Blanche is really a naturally born selfish slut, you know. So the book is about the question of whether you can redeem, somebody like Blanche can redeem herself. And I tried to make it quite a difficult challenge. For instance, when she finally finds her baby again, he's a highly unattractive baby. So I didn't want to make it too obvious or too cute. I don't see maternal love as just a normal, natural, effortless thing. I think it's this sort of, you know, plant that blooms on some very stony soil sometimes. So yes, the baby element of the book surprised me.
But then to follow up on the previous question, you find a book that gives you ideas. Do you then go do archival research?
Oh, yeah.
Back to so you go to the original sources.
Yeah.
And how was that? How was that process?
This time it was highly enjoyable. I did almost all of it on the internet because there are sources in online databases these days that just 15 years ago you would have had to go to every library in America, and I think my small children would have objected if I had attempted that pleasurable process. So I used sources like Ancestry.com and the Mormon database, for instance. I found the unexpected wedding of one of my characters in that database. So a lot of these websites just offer unprecedented searchable databases. Now, it's not that easy because if you search for somebody whose name is Jenny Bonnet, you find a picture of every Easter bonnet that was ever advertised in a 19th century newspaper. It was very difficult to find Blanche, and finally I had the brainwave of Blanche sounds a bit like a stage name. So I decided she could have been somebody else, Benon, and finally I found her in a ship's passenger list as Adèle Benon. And I would have found her before, except I was looking for somebody traveling with her man, Arthur Donoghue, and the database, they used computers to scan these handwritten sources, so they had read his name as Beneuve instead of Deneuve. So, you know, clerical errors, scanning errors, searching errors, so you have to be really patient and go over and over these sources. It was very, you know, it's hard on the eyesight, but it was highly enjoyable work. And as I say, I was never afraid that the sources would be too full, because we are talking about nobodies here. It's not like in the past when I've sometimes written about relatively famous people and I'm genuinely overwhelmed. I once had Horace Walpole, the 18th century writer, as a character in one of my books, and his 40 volumes of published correspondence just haunted me in case there was some footnote that would have contradicted what I was inventing. So, you know, everything I found about these people was tiny little facts, but often very suggestive and interesting little facts. For instance, Jenny's father, who was an actor, I found that he was really late to her funeral, and that just told me so much about, you know, how he did his best as a dad, but he just found the whole thing too draining. So often it was just the smallest little facts that leapt out at me.
You must have been astonished in real life after the publication of Room, where it was found that the man had held these women in captivity in Cleveland.
Well, it's more that I think these cases come to life every few years. So I happened to write Room after the Fritzl case, but then J.C. Dugard was found, and then the Cleveland women. It'll be somebody else next year. I wasn't that astonished, because when I was researching Room, I looked into so many cases, not exactly like the setup in Room. It's very rare for a kidnapper to allow a child to be born, because children take a lot of work, you know. You know, cases of girls locked up in cellars are not that rare. I also drew on a Russian case in particular where the captor had, every time a baby was born, he'd brought it to an orphanage. So by the time the two young women got out, you know, the babies had been adopted, so they decided not to fight it, you know. So as I say, there were a few cases before my book, and there have been a few after. But one thing I did find really interesting was that when I was writing Room, I tried to make the man who's called Old Nick in my novel, I tried to have him think of himself as a good guy. I thought it was more interesting if, you know, he's not some slavering villain like, oh, I'm so evil. It's more like, oh, I'm giving her a pretty comfortable setup here. So I was in a way felt justified then when Ariel Castro made remarks like, that was a pretty harmonious home, he said. The idea that you could be such a monster and yet think of yourself as an okay person, I think it's a fascinating insight into human psychology. So.
Because of that fascinating insight into human psychology, Emma, have you found that you've been approached by any organisations to be a little bit to share some of your insights?
Not organisations, no. I think organisations want people who are truly experts, whereas the media just want anybody whose name they remember. So 2 hours after those women were released in Cleveland, I had to take my phone off the hook because worldwide media outlets were saying, let's get that novelist in. When of course I wrote my novel just based on everything I could find about the real cases, so it's not like I'm an expert in myself, In a way, all I did was study a whole body of material and then try and come up with a fictional story which would distill some of it, but it doesn't mean I'm anyway an expert on people's real suffering. So even though, of course, I was briefly tempted, I thought that'll sell lots more books, and then I thought, no! So I've never said a word about the Cleveland case in the media. I think it's just shameless when you see a novelist out there trying to, No, honestly, I would blush to set up as any kind of expert on real pain and misery. Another thing I'm often asked is, did you seek out kidnapped victims and interview them? I thought, the last thing they want to do is to go through it all over again to help a novelist, So no, I find it's more than possible to research anything without having to go and intrude on real people's suffering,
You may have already answered the question, but do you tend to do your research first and then write, or do you research as you go along because you might come up with things?
Both. I do a big block of research first, but it's not just research in the abstract, it's research and story planning. So, for instance, I had my main sources about Jenny's murder. I gathered up to almost 60 newspaper articles with the help of some scholars, and there was this brief reference to Arthur, Blanche's lover, being recently pocked by smallpox. So that led me into probably 3 weeks of research into the smallpox epidemic in San Francisco. So yes, I did a lot of research and then started writing it, but of course you constantly have to stop to look things up. And I could never hire anybody else to do my research for me because I'm not looking for, a cogent synopsis. I'm not looking for the standard description of these things. I'm looking for the odd details. So I just have to do it myself because there's a very organic movement for me between the research and the writing. I would never be able to say at the end of the day how much time I'd spent on each. It's more, I'll write half a sentence, Google something, have a thought, go back, write another half a sentence.
What led you to write Kissing the Witch? You delved into fairy tales.
Excellent thought. When I wrote my first 2 novels, I don't think I ever questioned the fact that they'd be set in contemporary Ireland and be about people roughly like me in terms of being Irish people, and I think the range I wrote was from about 17 to 30, so I stayed in my own territory. But then an Irish publisher who had done a series of sort of satirical feminist fairy tales, they suggested to me that I could do some for them. And I didn't end up publishing it with them, but I was very grateful to them for the notion, because actually as a child I'd been obsessed with fairy tales. It's just that when I began my writing career, I sort of thought, what you do is write a kind of coming-of-age novel about someone like you, But that little hint that I should look at my fairy tale interests was superb, because I found it completely freed me up to write in a different style and in a different period. I mean, fairy tales are sort of set in no particular period, but it's pre-modern, it's a world of sort of, candles and forests and so on. So I suppose the reason that publisher asked me was because of my, obvious feminism. But one thing I really loved exploring was kind of metaphorical readings of the magic, because I love anything in the oral tradition, and that would include both fairy tales and, say, in this book, there's lots of folk music. I love anything which has been passed on orally, because I think people wouldn't pass it on if the plot didn't have some riveting interest in every generation. So I love taking stories that might be about something clearly fantastical, like, say, The Little Mermaid, the tale. But then you start thinking about, on a psychological level, what does that mean, What does it mean that we need to tell a story about somebody who, changes half of herself to suit the one she loves, or to end up hybrid, half and half? One storyline that comes up in a lot of my different books is the Selkie story of, the woman from the sea captured by the sailor, and can you live in a foreign environment? And how do you cope with that longing to go back to your first element? So I would say fairy tales and the Bible are probably my biggest sources, mostly because I spent my childhood absolutely steeped in them, you know.
I was wondering if you enjoy the process of researching as much as the writing process, or is it something that you feel that you need to get over and done with so that you can quickly get to the task of writing?
No, I love it. I think if I felt I needed to get it over and done with, then I shouldn't be writing this kind of book, because if you even stop to say, how much research is this going to take, then you're in the wrong line of work. You have to do way too much research. You have to just follow every tangent of curiosity. You have to spend the morning looking at images of earthquakes, and then you decide, oh, well, I won't have any earthquake scenes in my book. You just have to research excessively and, you know, fill your mind with the sights and smells of the past, and then pluck the ones that you really need for your story. However, I don't think I would enjoy the research so much if I wasn't using it for fiction, because it would feel very passive. You know, I'm just absorbing images and text of the past and other people's work, so I would just feel kind of a little deadened after a while. What makes it lively for me is that even as I'm reading a bit of Mark Twain, I'm thinking, oh, you know what, that makes me think of a scene I could write. So it's active. It's like active listening or something. But again, if I had to just write entirely out of what's in my head already and not do the research, I think I would sort of hit the bottom of the barrel. I haven't had a very long or complicated life experience to draw on, you know. So yeah, I think the two are, you know, it's like two juggling hands or something. And some passages of my book might be very closely based. You know, some of my books, I've never done this, but if I went through my book and I sort of highlighted everything which was based on some factual source, in some passages it might be almost all, and then there'd be 20 pages where none of it is from a factual source. But it wouldn't really occur to me to divide it that way, because the two seem to go together so naturally, you know. I was just talking to John Banville about this yesterday, and he was saying, oh, you're just such a different kind of writer, Emma, because he said facts just make him feel, you know, rebuked. He hates them. You know, he does as little research for his books as he can. You know, he works entirely out of memory and imagination and sort of fumbling along. Facts just make him shrivel up, you know.
Did you get an idea for the next book from this book, or you don't have an idea yet?
Oh no, I'm working on the next two books already, but they wouldn't be from this book. I try and make each book a different world, you know. So actually my next one will be a kid's book. And if writing a murder mystery was a bit of a challenge to me, writing a kid's book is far scarier. Because when I was writing this one, I was very aware that it's a literary novel, but it's also a murder mystery, so I've got to please crime fans, and they are a very particular and specialist bunch, you know, in that they've all read a lot of crime, and they don't want to be fobbed off with a feeble plot, and they don't want to be given too many clues, but they want to be given enough clues. So I was really aware of them. But writing for 10-year-olds, that's even scarier, because who knows what they like. So, and they're not polite like adults are. So I think it's very important to keep setting yourself new and perhaps impossible tasks, especially after you've had one big hit. You would not want to in any way start coasting and saying, oh, I'm going to write stories about children in freakish situations forever.
Yes, I have an interesting education, and I was just wondering for young writers entering into creative writing, what you would recommend in terms of programs that they might be looking for, or things that you would recommend in terms of solid foundation.
So that's a really good question. I've never been asked that. When I was growing up in Ireland, writing novels was a fairly normal activity, and it was never addressed overtly in the educational system. The assumption was you went to school, you went to college, you maybe got a job, and in your private life you read a lot and you wrote privately in your room. So I never did any kind of creative writing course. And I would say many great writers today, it's the same thing. They haven't been to any specific qualification in creative writing. However, equally, other very good writers have. So it sort of depends on your temperament. You know, if you're 20 and you think you would enjoy, you know, sharing your writing with a group and getting feedback on it from the group and reading others' work, if you feel you could write best in that sort of sociable setup, then I think creative writing programs are probably a great idea. But they're not necessary. It's only one route. I think the essential route to take, though, is to read a lot. I remember once I was a writer in residence, and poets in particular would come along, and I'd say to them, who's your favorite poet? And they'd go, oh, I don't really read any except myself. I'd think that's a bad sign. So I don't know any writers who don't read and read voraciously. Often when I meet other mothers at the playground, they say, "Oh, I've no time to read." And I think, well, if you want to enough, you find the time, you know. You chat to your 6-year-old over the pages of the New Yorker. When my 6-year-old was a baby, she used to actually bat the New Yorker out of my hand. But I feel I'm setting her a good example, you know. And also I can multitask. You know, the Irish typically talk while listening. Some would say we don't listen, but that's not true. We are listening at the same time. We're just cleverer than the rest of you. So I feel I can talk to my children and read a book at the same time.
In light of the sort of the changing face of Ireland in the last 10 or 15 years, we both know what we're talking about in this.
Ireland got rich and then lost it all.
Yeah, but we do famine good. Come on, let's face it. I've noticed young, interesting writers coming up the wire. Donoghue, and I've also seen how Banville and Sebastian Barry and some of the others are kind of changing. Joseph O'Connor. Are you interested at all in writing about like the last 15 years in Ireland?
I would say I touched on the boom in my novel Landing, because I'd done my first 2 set in Dublin sort of pre-boom, and so it was great fun to go back and to choose one character in particular and see what she would have become, you know, and see how she would have, you know, got in on the money action and so on. So I enjoyed that very much. I haven't felt tempted to go back since, and I think it is quite daunting to describe the Irish economic rise and fall. I notice a lot of Irish writers turned to historical fiction in those years as if it was too hard to get any kind of purchase on what was happening. People use satire a lot. I mean, a brilliant novel like, I'm forgetting the writer's name, but I think it's called The Devil You Know, and it's a kind of a, you know, Faustian story about an Irish man and property. So I think in a way, describing what happened to Ireland in the last 15 years, you probably need tools like satire.
Two quick questions. Would you consider writing a memoir? Has that ever, is it a genre that you would?
I'll answer that one quickly. No, my life has not been interesting enough. It's a great one to live, but there's not much to say about it.
Can you say something about, I know you're a playwright, can you say something about playwriting versus novels? And just
Sure. Again, I would never give up either. I spend more time on novels these days, and they're certainly what pays the mortgage. But I love plays too. Novels are something that people often retreat to after experiences in either screenwriting or theatre writing, because those experiences are so collaborative, which is wonderful, but also it's a bit scary. You know, say when actors start saying things like, "I think my character would," and you're going, "Hang on, I'm the writer here." And so we often retreat to fiction and go, "Phew, we are alone. The power is entirely ours." But then when you've been in your room for a few years on your own, then somebody says, "Ooh, come develop a play with me." So you're like, "Okay, people." So it's a very refreshing contrast, just as going between the past and the present are for me. And so last year at the Dublin Theatre Festival, I did a play about the Irish writer Maeve Brennan, who worked at the New Yorker. And I really enjoyed that as an experience, because it's scary, but in a good way. You know, when the director in particular, or even the designer, or even the actors, when they're asking questions and you have to go home and do frantic rewrites overnight, you know, it's wonderfully interactive and very lively in a very immediate way. And also actors contribute so much to your lines. The lines aren't alive until the actors say them. So I find doing a play every now and then an absolutely thrilling experience, yeah.
Does anyone else have one more question? There we go. Louisa.
No, except I learned, I went to an acting class, a drama class, which was all about improvisation, so I suppose in a way it taught me to write plays as much as to be in them. So I was in drama classes from about 13 to 18. And this is why when I give readings, I'm total ham. Some writers think you should just read aloud in a monotone and let the words speak for themselves. And it's not that I don't trust my words, it's just I so enjoy adding a bit of performance to them. But I would say that drama class was probably a great preparation, not just for playwriting, but for writing dialogue in my fiction. I've always found dialogue the most effortless stuff to churn out. In fact, writing characters who are rather silent is sometimes a bit of a challenge to me, because I feel a bit like, if you don't have anything to say, what are you contributing, you know? So yeah, I think theatre class was probably hugely helpful there.
Don't just read aloud in a monotone. The performance was much better. Thank you.
I see a lot of these, and I can tell you that this is really
All right, folks, a quick reminder for our internet audience at home. There's still time for you to call the number on your screen, purchase a copy of Frog Music, and we will have Emma sign that for you. For those of you here in the house, we have Frog Music as well as all of Emma's previous titles for sale at the counter over here. I'm actually going to steal her from you for a second because we're going to be signing over on the east side of the store.